Again, my name is John Carlson. I'm the Director of Training here at RAN 3D, longtime Creo user, over 28 years of experience on the software. And today we want to go through and talk about sweeps. It's one of the fundamental ways of creating something inside Creo. Now, you've got extrude, revolve, sweep, and blend. Now, sweeps can go from very simple to very complex. There are a lot of options that go with this command. And so we're going to go through and look at those various options and how you can go through and use them to your advantage. Now, first thing I want to talk about is just, basically what is a sweep in Creo. So a sweep is defined by two things. It's defined by a trajectory, and that's simply the path that you want to go through and follow along. And then once you've got your trajectory defined, you'll come back and define a cross section. The computer will sweep that cross section along the path to go through and create the shape on there. Now, the trajectory, you go through and you define the trajectory first. That's the path you want to follow. And that's usually an existing sketch. You just pick the sketch and say, hey, that's my trajectory. You can also go through and use edges as solids if you want as well. But the cross section you cannot pre-create. You have to go through and create that sketch internally when you go through and make a sweep in Creo. So you can create the trajectory beforehand. The cross section has to be internal. Now, to do it again, you just come over and say, okay, I want to go through and make a sweep, and this is going to bring up the dashboard. And of course, here's all the options. And then the first thing you really want to do, of course, is come over here and just get that trajectory defined. So again, expand down the word references, and now you're going to go through and see the area. Now, when you go to pick that trajectory again, you would just select the curve from the screen, and it's going to go through and list the first one that you should select there as the origin. Now, it is possible to have more than one trajectory. If you wanted more than one, you would just do Control and then keep picking. And it would then go through and add other trajectories here, chain 1, chain 2 at that point. And then once you've got your trajectories defined, you can see there are some options down below here that go through and kind of let you control how exactly this is going to go through and work. And we're going to go through and look at all these options here as we go through today in the presentation on here. And again, up above, of course, you have your normal buttons here that you would see in your dashboard. Again, you can build this as a solid. You can build this as a surface. You can go through and remove material. You've got your thin button here as well. So those are all in pretty much every feature in Creo. And then you're going to have some specific buttons here that we'll talk about up above for the sweep command. Now, I'm trying to get rid of my highlighter here. Now, when you define that trajectory, one thing you do need to pay attention to is you do need to pay attention to what they call the start point. Now, the start point will come up, and it's going to go through and be kind of a circle and an arrow on your screen. And so here's the start point right here in the corner. Here's the start point over here. Now, if you've got an open trajectory, like you see here on the left, your start point has to be at one end or the other. Now, if it's at the wrong end and you want it to be at the other end, if you just pick on the arrow, it will jump to the other end. But if you've got like a closed trajectory, like you see over here on the right, the start point can be any corner. So if you wanted to go through and change the corner, you could go through and just drag this circle and it would move it into the new corner if you wanted it to be. But an open trajectory, it's got to be at one of the ends. If it's closed, it can be anywhere along there. Now, once you've got that trajectory defined, when you come up here and want to make the cross section, all you have to do is come up here and just hit the pencil button at the top. And when you hit the pencil button, it's going to go through and take you then into the sketcher to draw that. Now, what will happen is the trajectory that you've gone through and defined, it will go through and get laid horizontal on the screen. So they're going through in this example here again and kind of making a handle on a coffee cup. And so this is their trajectory. That's going to go through and get laid horizontal here as they enter into the sketcher on here. And that's just what Creo uses automatically to define the orientation. And then once you've gone through and made your cross section, and then it's going to go through and complete the sweep. Now, also what you're looking for is you're looking for these two center lines right here. These two center lines are where your start point was located. So they have their start point down here at the bottom of this particular shape. The computer will snap to those center lines automatically when you sketch the cross section. Now, your cross section doesn't have to be right on those. You could go through and sketch it off to the side, but if you were to sketch it off to the side, it would maintain that distance away, as it's swept along. So typically it's right on those two center lines or very near it. when you go through and create it. And then one option to keep in mind is there is an option here for going through and merging the ends. Now again, in this coffee cup example, again, they're going through and they're sweeping along over here. And so again, this is their trajectory. And then their cross section. The cross section is always going to be held perpendicular to the path by default. And so again, I'm coming into this angled face here. So it's going to go through and leave this little gap behind here that I really want to close off. And so to close that, you can just come over into options and turn on the merge ends. And when you merge ends, it's just going to continue the sweep then into that next face that's at the angle to get rid of that little gap on there. So that's a fairly common option that you would go through and use. And then going through and making a sweep vary. Now on those examples we looked at earlier, it was a constant cross section all the way down. It is possible to go through and make a sweep that can vary. Now to do that, you do have to come up here and make sure that the variable button is turned on. And so this is the variable button here. This will allow the sweep to vary. Now there's a couple different ways that you can go through and vary the shape. There's kind of 3 ways. We're going to look at all 3. This button could potentially turn itself on automatically if you've got more than one trajectory, but you may have to manually turn it on if you don't. Now, one way to go through and vary the shape as you sweep along is just have more than one trajectory. So you can see here in this example, they've got 2. They've got this straight line over here on the left as their first trajectory, so that's the origin. And then they've got this second trajectory over here on the right as chain number 1. And so now what's going to happen is when you go into the sketcher to go through and draw your shape, you can actually snap to the ends of these 2 trajectories here. So again, there's going to be the 2 center lines over here at the end of this one. There's just going to be an X over here at the end of the second. But now when you go through and sketch the rectangular shape here, it's going to snap right onto those points. And so now the rectangle is going to get wider and narrower as it goes along on here. So that would be one way. And that's probably the most common way that you would go through and vary the shape on a sweep, is to go through and use those trajectories as guides on there. Now you also could go through and do it by what they call using a relationship and trajpar on here. Now again, in this example, if I don't go through and use this relationship, it's going to sweep along and it's going to get wider, but the height would be constant. And if I back up this slide here, they got a height of 50. Well, what if I want it to be 50 at this end, but I want it to be some other value at the other end? So now what they're doing is they're coming back and adding a relationship. Now when you go to add this relationship, you will be inside the sketcher, and they're just finding out whatever the name of this one dimension is here for the height, and that happens to be SD4 right here. They're just saying that that dimension is equal to 50, because that's what they want this dimension to start at. And then they're going through and saying plus trajpar times 75. Now, anytime that you have a sweep, there's a parameter called trajpar that you can use. And it just stands for trajectory parameter. And where your sweep begins, trajpar basically is 0. So at this point right here, trajpar is 0. When I get over here to the other end, trajpar is 1. So it represents just 0% and 100%. When I'm halfway down my sweep, my trajpar value would be 0.5 at that position. So with this example here again, it's going to start at 0 times 75. Of course, that's going to go through and be 0 plus 50. It's going to start at a value of 50. But at the other end then, trajpar will be 1. So 1 times 75 plus 50, it's going to be 125 tall here at the other end. So by using this trajpar in a relationship, I could go through and vary the section that way as well. So you just need a relationship that will give you the shape you want. But you're going to be pretty limited on what you can do with that method on there. And then you also could go through and use a graph to go through and drive the sweep. And so I want that dimension to go up and down as it sweeps along. Now, to go through and use a graph, you would have to go through and create a graph feature. And so this is a feature that you'll need to go through and create beforehand. And then when you go to make this graph, it will pop up a window for you to go through and sketch the shape in on here. And when you make the graph, you do have to add a coordinate system right here. And that just represents where the sweep begins here. So that's 0 of trajpar. And as you look horizontally here on your graph, that represents as you go along the sweep. And as you look at these kind of vertical dimensions here, This just represents the size of whatever you're going to control. Now in this example, I'm going to go through and control this dimension here. So at the beginning, it's going to go through and be 35. Now it's going to go through and maintain that value for a while, and then it's going to start to go up. When it gets to this point, it's going to level off again, and then it's going to come back down here to 0 at the other end. So I can go through and make this graph that then tells me how that dimension is going to change as it sweeps along. Now, just making the graph, once you've created it and you say done, doesn't do anything. You will have to go through and add a relationship into your sweep. So again, back into the sketcher, you would just find out what the name of that dimension is. So it's SD4 in this case, is equal to, and you want to link it to the graph. So you go through and say eval graph, and then inside brackets and inside quotes, you put the name of your graph. So again, I call my graph height over here. So I would just type in height here. And then comma trajpar. And again, this trajectory parameter, that's going to run from 0 to 1. And then they're multiplying, in this case, by 100. Now, the reason they're multiplying by 100 is that's the length that they made their graph over here. You can make your graph any length that you want. If I was to go through and make my graph like 50 units long, I would then multiply by 50 over here. This is just normalizing the length of the graph. If you don't multiply by the length of your graph, though, the computer will go through and just read the first 1 inch of your graph and treat that as the entire length of your sweep on here. So if you make your graph 1 unit long, you won't need to go through and multiply by a value. But if you make it some other length, you will need to multiply by that to get it to work. Now, once you've gone through and added this relationship, that's now going to go through and have that dimension go up and down based upon the graph. If you come back and change the graph, it's going to go through and update the sweep when you go through and do that. So that's also a pretty common way that you would go through and change the shape. Now, when you do sweep along, what do you go through and stay normal to? By default, as you go through and make a sweep, the computer will stay normal to the trajectory on here. Now, in this example here, they've got a sweep with just one trajectory. So again, they've got kind of this circle sketch here that's sweeping along. So again, it's going through and staying normal here to that straight line. Here it's starting to go through and turn the section. Here it's going to go through and be perpendicular again to this line. Again, it's going to turn it again as it sweeps down. So by default, it always makes that cross section normal to the path that you follow along. Now, in some cases, you may want to follow that path, but you don't want to stay normal to it. And so there are some ways that you could go through and change that on there. Now, one way that you could go through it and control what you stay normal to is you can drop down here and do this section plane control on here. And there's going to go through and be 3 choices that you can go through and choose from with that. One of your choices over here would be normal to trajectory, and that's the default. Now, if you've got normal to trajectory turned on, you notice there's an N column over here on your drop down where it lists your trajectories. The one that has the check mark is the one that you're going to stay normal to. Now, if I got more than one trajectory and I don't want to stay normal to that first one, I could add the check mark down here to chain 2 and then change that. So if you've got normal to trajectory turned on, you've got to choose one of those trajectories in the N column. Now, if I don't want to use one of those trajectories, then I could come over here and say normal to projection or constant normal direction. And then what it would let you do is it would let you go through and pick another item that you wanted to stay normal to. This could be like another curve, or this could be like a datum plane. Now, the only real difference between these 2 choices is if you stay normal to projection, you pick what you want to be perpendicular to. If you say constant normal direction, you pick what you want to be parallel to as you sweep along on there with that. And again, I'm going to give you examples of all these here in a couple minutes in the demonstration part. So those are kind of the 3 choices you'll get to control what you stay normal to. And again, there's an example here. Notice they've got a couple of trajectories here. They just got kind of a straight line that goes straight front to back, and they got another one that runs across at a slight angle. And so again, the one that goes straight front to back, that's their origin trajectory. And then the other one that goes off at the slight angle is chain number 1. So again, they've got those 2 trajectories selected. And then you'll notice here as they sweep this shape along now, if they've got the origin trajectory check marked, it's going to keep the cross section perpendicular to it. If they've got chain number 1 selected, you'll notice how it takes the cross section and makes it perpendicular to the one off at the angle. So you would get a different result if you did that. Now, also you'll notice it will always sweep the length of the shortest trajectory. So in this particular case, the sketch plane, it has to go through and pass across both trajectories. So when it runs into the end of this one curve, that's where the sweep will end on that example at the bottom right. They're just changing kind of what they're staying normal to by choosing a different curve. Now here in this example, they're going through and using normal to projection. Again, they're going to sweep along those same two curves, but now they're using this datum plane here as their reference. So you'll notice how it's going through and holding the cross section perpendicular to that plane as it sweeps along. And then here in this example, the only real difference is they're using the constant normal direction. So now when they pick this datum plane here, DTM2, it's going through and holding the cross section parallel to that as it sweeps along. So those are kind of the three ways that you can control what you stay normal to. One of the trajectories, or I can be perpendicular or parallel to something as I go along. And then you also have this horizontal vertical control on here. Now, most of the time you will not change this, but there are three choices. There's going to be automatic, there's going to be normal to surface, and there's going to be X trajectory on here. Now with automatic turned on, it just means the computer picks which way is horizontal as you enter the sketcher, and you can't control that. And then that horizontal stays the same all the way down. If you come over here and do normal to surface, as you sweep along, you can have it be perpendicular to a surface. Or if you were to do X trajectory, it would follow some other curve that you've established. And again, we'll look at some examples here. Now, in this example here, what they've got is they've got the horizontal vertical control set to automatic. So again, they got two trajectories here. Again, they get the straight line that goes front to back, and they got this other one that goes off at a slight angle here of 15 degrees. But with automatic turned on, the direction that the computer chooses is horizontal. It just goes through and keeps this the same all the way down. So the section does not rotate at all as it goes along. Probably what you want on here. Now, if you were to come back over here, though, and turn on X trajectory here, now what it's going to do is it's going to use this second trajectory here as the X. And you'll notice over here in your dialog box, there's actually a column here for the X trajectory. So as this thing starts to rise up, you'll also notice how it takes the cross section and starts to rotate it. So at the end, this thing would be tipped up at the 15-degree angle as it goes along. So you're really just kind of controlling how does horizontal change as you go along. You could have some other curve then that defines that. Not super common, but it is an option. And then the normal to surface. Now for this to work, you either have to have a sketch that's on a surface or some type of curve that's on a surface, or the trajectory has to be an edge of a solid on here. And so I've got this one curve here that's on top of this surface. And if I've got this normal to surface option turned on, what it's going to do is it's going to go through and hold the cross section perpendicular to the path. So this thing's going to be 90 degrees to the surface as it sweeps along. But when the surface starts to tip, this is going to start to tip as well to go through and maintain the 90 degrees as it goes along. If this was not turned on, normal to surface, it would go through and use whatever this kind of orientation is all the way down. So this section would not kind of turn with the surface as it went along. That will come on automatically anytime that you go through and pick an edge or a curve that's on a surface. And again, that's what they're trying to show you here. You can see the end result now as this thing sweeps down. You can see how it's kind of turning as it goes along. And then when you make a sweep, you can also make the sweep tangent on here. So here they've got kind of two surfaces in this example right here. And they got surface number 1 over here on the left. They got surface number 2 over here on the right. And those are already completed. And now they want to go through and fill in the middle area here with a new surface. So again, you can just say, okay, I want to use this here as a trajectory here. I want to go through and use this trajectory here. And you think, okay, I'm just going to go through and maybe sketch like a spline here. And I'm going to go through and make a tangent here and tangent here. And you could do that. And that would allow you to go through and then take that curve and sweep it along. But if you just did it that way, it wouldn't end up being tangent at every spot along here. I want to go through and kind of sweep along these two edges, but I want it to go through and recalculate what the slope angle should be to make a tangent at all points. So to do that, what you can now do is use the tangent trajectory column over here. Now, for this to be available, you have to pick the edge of a surface or you have to pick the edge of a solid on here. Otherwise, this T column will not open itself up. Now, they've got three trajectories here. The straight line is just the origin. I just want to stay perpendicular to that as I go along. And again, you would pick the edges of these surfaces as chain number 1, chain number 2 on here. And then just check mark, okay, I want to go through and maintain tangency. And what's going to happen now is when you enter the sketcher, it's going to take you into the sketcher, but the computer's also going to create a couple more references for you if you've got the tangent trajectory turned on. It's going to go through and create this line here, and it's going to go through and create this angled line right here. That represents the current direction or tangency at that position of the surface. And so now what I can do is when I go through and sketch my spline here, is I can go through and make a tangent to these two lines that pop up. And what will happen is as this sweeps down, the computer will reevaluate that tangency at all positions and then update that shape to match. So if you want to sweep along and maintain tangency, you've got to make sure that you've got that tangent column turned on to do that. And again, I'll give you an example of that here in the demonstration. Now, biggest reason a sweep may fail is it just self-intersects. If it doesn't work, this is probably the reason why. So in this example, they've got a sweep here, and again, they've got some type of trajectory here that goes along and goes outside the part and comes back in. That's not really a problem on there. That's okay. Their issue is they've got a section here, and it's a really wide cross section. And so as this thing sweeps down along here, it's really too wide in this area here. It comes back through itself when it turns this corner right here. And so as soon as it goes back through itself in this area here, that's going to cause it to fail on here. So you always got to kind of take into account the tightest radius that you're following along. That's going to determine the maximum width that your sweep could be. If I wanted to create a shape like this, you would just need to split this into two. You would need to sweep down to this point here. Once you had that half of the sweep created, now come back and complete the rest of the sweep. That's a different feature. So it can't self-intersect as you create it. Okay, so let me give you a quick example of a couple of these things. It's a lot easier to show you than it is actually to talk about. And so let's just start out with a really simple example here of going through and making a sweep. So I've just got a solid here and I've got a curve already created. So I'm just going to come back over and say, okay, I want to make a sweep. And then this is where I'd go right to references and expand this down and then just choose my trajectory. Okay, I want to follow this red curve right there. So I'm going to pick it. Now, this is my start point right here, this circle and arrow. So it's telling me it's going to put the section at this end. Now, for some reason, you wanted the section at the other end. If you were just to pick on this arrow, it would jump to the other end over there. But again, I'm just going to move it back where it was. Now, once I've got that set in the right position, I'm just going to come up here and hit my pencil button. I'm ready to create the cross section. And it's going to turn me then into the sketcher. And then notice how it took that trajectory and laid it horizontal on the screen. Again, if you don't understand what you're looking at, just spin this around to get a better look. You can see it a little bit better there. Again, I'll go back to my sketch view, and the computer will snap right to this. So I'm going to keep it simple. I'm just going to go through and make a rectangle, but you can see it'll snap right onto there when I create that. Now, when I come over and say OK, it's just going to sweep down, and it's going to go through and create the shape. Now, if I do Control D and go back to my default view, you can see it's sweeping along, but it's currently set to add material. So I really want to remove, so I'm just going to turn on the remove button up above and then sweep along. But you can see it doesn't quite go through the end here because I'm coming in at an angle. Now, to get that to go through the end, most likely what you would do, like we talked about, is just come up here under Options and turn on the Merge Ends. That's going to continue that into the next phase on there. Now, another possibility, if I turn that off, is you can see there are some handles here on your trajectory. This allows me to go through and control how much of that trajectory do I use. I can actually drag this shorter, but I can also go through and drag this longer and extrapolate out. So I can just go through and make my trajectory a little bit longer by dragging if I wanted to as well. But again, most likely you just say Merge Ends in this case to complete it through. And then once that looks good again, I would just say Done to complete that first sweep. Again, if I go back to my default view, I also want to make another sweep here. I just want to go through and kind of make a flange that goes along some edges here. So I'm going to go back to sweep. On that first example, I was picking a sketch. Now what I want to do here is for my trajectories, I want to use these edges here, the solid. So I'm going to pick that edge to get started. Now I want to add on to that though. Now if you do Control and I pick another edge, it's going to start to add a second trajectory over here, chain number 1. And I really don't want that. So I'm going to right click and remove that. I want to add on to what I already started. I don't want to create a new one. So rather than do control, do shift. And now when I do shift, I can pick other edges, but it just keeps adding on to what I've already got selected is all it's going to go through and do. And then once I've got all these edges selected, that's what I want to follow along. Now again, I just have to hit my pencil button over here. That's going to take me into the sketcher. And so again, I can now go through and sketch my cross section. And again, I'll keep this simple. Just make a little rectangle there. And now when I say OK, it's going to sweep that down along those edges to create the shape. So keep in mind, it can be a curve. It could be edges of a solid when you're making a sweep. And again, just use your shift key if you want to add more entities onto that trajectory. So those are some simple examples. Let's take a look at a little bit more complicated example. So I'm going to go here to this next model, and I want to go through and let's just delete what I've got here. I'm going to eventually end up with something that looks like that. But before I do that, I want to go through and kind of show you a couple things first on here. And so I want to come over and turn my datum planes on, at least this one. And I just want to go through and kind of sweep along and show you how to control what you stay normal to. So I'm going to come over and just make a sweep. And I'm going to come over here again, and just for my references, I'm going to pick this as my trajectory. I want to just follow that curve right there. I will move my start point down here to the other end just by clicking on it. And I'm just going to go into the sketcher. And I'm going to keep this pretty simple. So I'm just going to sketch a circle here for the shape. I won't worry about the size. And when I say OK, of course, it's going to sweep it down to go through and create it. Now, if I was to come over here and take a look at this in the top view, you can go through and see how it's going through and sweeping along, and it's staying normal to that curve that I'm following over here. You know, what if I want to go through and change that on here? Now, one thing I could do is I could come back over here and add a second trajectory. And if I did control and picked on this straight line here, you know, I could add that. And if I was to move the end column down to here, notice how it stays normal to that on here. So by going through and having that turned on, you know, I could use a second curve potentially. Now, if I don't want to use one of these trajectories, okay, I don't want to stay really normal to either of those, that's where you could come down here then and either use normal to projection or constant normal direction. Again, I'm going to do normal to projection. And if I was to go through and pick now on this datum plane, it would now go through and hold my cross section perpendicular to that plane on there. Now you'll notice it doesn't go the entire length, because again, when it goes through and kind of holds that cross section perpendicular here, when it runs to the end of this one curve, you know, it stops. So again, you can go through and drag these things longer. So this would sweep the full length if you wanted to on there. Those are kind of the ways that you can control what you stay normal to. It can be one of the curves, or it could be some other type of item. And the only difference with constant normal direction is you'd pick the item that you want the cross section to stay parallel to as you go along. And again, once it looks good, I could say done, and I could complete that. Now, I don't really want that sweep, so I'm going to go through and delete that and say, OK. Let's talk about how to vary the shape. I don't need to see this datum plane anymore, so I'll turn that off. So I want to come back here now and do another sweep, but I want to vary the cross section as I go along. So this is where, again, I'm first going to come over and pick a couple of trajectories. So this is trajectory number 1, my origin. Do control. This is trajectory number 2, chain number 1. And so now that I got those two trajectories selected, you'll notice the variable button turned itself on up above. So it's going to go through and allow this to vary now because I have more than one trajectory. And then if I hit my pencil button here again, go back into the sketcher, if you look, I got two center lines here at the end of that first origin, and I just got a little point over here at the end of the other trajectory. But if I was to sketch a rectangle now, this rectangle will snap right onto those points on here. And then for the height of this, I don't really care, but I'll go through and let's say modify this to 35 right now for the height. And now when I say OK, you'll notice how it follows those two trajectories down to change the shape. Now keep in mind, you could have as many trajectories as you wanted. You could have 3, 4. As long as that shape can adapt to those trajectories, it will then go through and follow along and change as it goes. Now, I mentioned up above, there's the variable button. If I was to turn that off, you'll notice it won't vary the shape on here. Even though it's snapped to those, if you don't have the variable button turned on, it won't allow it to change as it goes along. So that would go through and be one way to create a sweep that changed the shape. And that's probably the most common way, just have more than one trajectory. Now, let's say I also want to go through and kind of vary that thickness. Right now that thickness is 35 all the way down. So I want to go through and vary that as I go along. So what I'm going to go through and do now is I'm going to come back here and edit definition on this. And when I go through and edit definition on this, now I'm going to come back here and add a relationship onto this. Now, I want to add a relationship that's going to vary the height. So I need to go back into the sketch because that's where I find that dimension for the height. And then once I'm back here in the sketcher, just come up here under tools, and I'm going to come over here and say, okay, tools, relations. And then when I do that, you can see I currently don't have any relationships inside the sketch. So again, I want to go through and make some type of relationship that's going to go through and vary this height as it goes along. So all I need to do is find that dimension name. So that's SD4 over here. So SD4 is going to go through and be equal to, and let's say I want to go through and start at a value of 35. I'm already at 35. So I'm going to go through and say 35. And I'm then going to come over here and say plus, and then this is where I'm going to go through and use trajpar. I'm going to come over here and say trajpar. You do have to spell this correctly. And then once I got trajpar, I'm going to go through and multiply here by, let's say, 50 on here. So remember, trajpar will start at 0. So 0 times 50 is 0 plus 35. So it's going to start at 35. At the other end, where trajpar becomes 1, it's going to end up being 85. So now when I come over here and say OK, I can now just come back over here to sketch, OK here, and then you'll notice if I go back to my default view, how it's now going through and slowly ramping up from the 35 to the 85 based upon that relationship that I went through and created. So that would be another way that you could vary the shape. But again, you're kind of limited to that relationship that you can type out. Now, let's say I want to go through and have a more substantial change with that dimension. I want to do up and down and stuff. This is where I could also potentially go through and use a graph here. Now, what I'm going to do is I have to make the graph. So I'm going to come over here under my datum dropdown and come over here and choose graph. And when I do that, it's now going to ask me for the name of my graph. And again, this can have any name that you want. I'm just going to come over here and call it HT for height. And then when I hit enter, it's now going to go through and take me into the sketcher. So this is where I'm going to go through and make my graph. It's just a 2D window for doing that. And I have to have a coordinate system for this to work. And that just represents where the sweep begins. And I'm going to add a couple of center lines. Now, I don't really need to have these center lines, but they do help me dimension this. And that's the reason I'm adding them. And then what I want to do is I actually want to create the physical shape of the graph. Now remember, as I go left to right, that just represents as I go along the sweep. And then the up and down represents the size of the item. So I'm going to start out here and have it be constant for a while. I want this to rise up. I want it to go and keep the same value for a little bit more distance, and then come down to nothing here at the end. So that's how that dimension is going to go through and change as it sweeps along. Now, I do need to get some dimensions added on here. So I'm going to add a dimension here for an overall length. I'm also going to add a dimension here for this length. And that's why I went through and put these center lines in here. It just makes creating these dimensions a little bit simpler on here. And then this dimension is fine. I'll just move it up a little bit. And then I want to make a height dimension here for that as well. And I also want to have a height dimension here. So that's going to be the dimension scheme that I want to have on here. Now, this is currently 15.31 long. Remember, your graph can be any length you want. You just need to kind of normalize by multiplying. I always like to make my graph 100, and so it's really easy to figure out percent. I'm 0%, I'm 100%. So I'm way out of scale here with my numbers. So what I'm going to do is just make a big box around this sketch. So I highlight everything. And I'm going to come up here and just use my modify button at the top. Now remember, with modify, you can go through and modify dimensions one at a time if you want over here by going through and changing the thumb wheels. But if I just say lock scale, as I change that one dimension, everything gets bigger and smaller together. So I'm just going to make this one dimension here 100 and then get this close to the right size on there. Just need to refit this. And then once I've done that, now I want to edit these numbers to the final value. Now let's say I want to start out here fairly thin. So I'm going to go through and modify this and say, okay, I want this to go through and just be 25 here at the start. And then I want to modify this, and at the thickest point, I want to go through and say, okay, I want to go through and make this, let's say 75 on there. And then the other dimensions I want to modify are these distances along. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this dimension here and make that 40. So for the first 40%, it's going to be 25. And then what I'm going to do is make this dimension here 60. And then it's going to go through now from the 40% to the 60%. It's going to rise up from 25 to 75. I'm going to keep this here and make this 85. And then out to the 85% point, it's going to go through and be that height of 75. And then at that point, it's going to start to come down to 0 at the end on here. So now that I got my graph created, I can just say OK, and that will go through and close that window. Now you can see it's over here, though, in my model tree. Now, I created the sweep first, and I created the graph second. I really want to do a reorder here. I really want this graph to be in front of that sweep, so I'm just going to quick drag it up there, because I'm going to reference this in a relationship. And now that I've gone through and kind of reordered it, I'm going to go back to my sweep over here, and I'm going to go through and edit definition. And when I edit definition here, it's going to take me back again into the sweep. I'm going to hit my pencil button here, go back into the sketcher. And what I want to do now is I want to add that relationship again. So back here under tools again, relations, to go through and bring up my relationship editor. Now I've still got that old relationship here, which I really don't want anymore. So I'm going to go through and delete that and get rid of it. And I want to go through and link it to the graph. So again, it's still going to be that same dimension, SD4. SD4 now is going to go through and be equal to, and I want to say eval graph over here. And then inside brackets and inside quotes, and it can be a double or a single quote, type in the name of your graph. I called my graph HT. And then comma, again, trajpar for a trajectory parameter. And then multiply by the length of your graph. And I made my graph 100 on here. So I'm just going to go through and add that and end it with the bracket. And then once I've got that, that looks good. Make sure I spelled everything correctly, and I did. So I'm just going to come over and say OK. And then you'll notice how that dimension now just switched to 25, because that's what my graph told it to be at the beginning. And now if I come back over here to my sketch tab and then exit out of my sketcher, you can see now how the sweep is going to follow along with the graph. So it maintains, again, that 25 distance for the first 40%, goes up to 75, and then comes back down to 0. Now, that graph does control it. So again, if you want to change it, oh, that's not quite what I want. Again, if you come back over here, edit definition on your graph, you can come back over here and change this. Once you get back into the sketcher again, if you were to modify something here, okay, yeah, I want this to be thicker here at the beginning. I want to go through and make this like 40 on here. Again, when I say OK, it's going to go through and update that to be 40, a little bit thicker here at the beginning. So the graph will let you go through and change any dimension as you kind of sweep along the value. So those are kind of the 3 ways to change the shape. Now, I also want to give you an example here real quick of going through and just controlling kind of what you stay normal to here. So again, this is what I want to end up with, what you see here, but I'm going to delete this because obviously it's already done. And so I want to go through and just kind of sweep along this one sketch or curve that's on that surface on there. So again, if I just come over here and say sweep, again, I just need to come over here, of course, and get my trajectory defined on here. And that's really all I need is just one trajectory here. And then notice this does default to normal to surface automatic over here, because I picked a curve that's on a surface. And so if I come over here into my pencil button and just hit this, of course, it's going to take me in. I'm just going to sketch a line coming straight up on here. And now when I go through and say, OK, I didn't turn on my surface option before I came in here, so I'm going to turn it on now. And then also it just sweeps along, but it's going through and kind of holding that cross-section perpendicular to that surface on here. Now, if I was to come back over here and turn this off and just use automatic, notice with automatic, it doesn't allow that section then to go through and kind of turn with the surface on there. So it just really kind of maintains that first angle all the way down if I have that turned on. So that would be one kind of example of changing what you stay normal to. And then the other one I want to show you here is what if I want to go through and kind of sweep along, but I want to kind of twist the shape. I want to create something that looks like this when I'm done in here. So if I look at this, just spin this around, it's got a constant width here, and it just kind of goes up and down with this curve on here. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to delete this. And I'm going to come back here and make a sweep. And again, I want to get a couple of my trajectories defined first. So this is trajectory number 1. I'm going to do control. This is trajectory number 2. Now I'm going to leave it right now here, just the automatic for the start. And I'm just going to come over and say, okay, I want to make my cross section. It's going to take me into the sketcher. And I'm just going to sketch a rectangle here. I'll keep this simple. And then for my width over here, again, I'm going to make this 35 on here. And then this isn't super critical, but I'll go through and make, let's say, this 8. And now I want to go through and say, okay, it just basically sweeps down. But you can see how that section is obviously not tipping or anything. I left it here at just automatic. So the computer just keeps horizontal the same all the way down. Now, since I've got multiple trajectories here, though, I could actually switch this and say, okay, I want to go through and do X trajectory. And then notice how it goes through and changes the shape and now forces it to go up and down with this curve on here. So with that turned on, it's going to go through and use the curve to control which way is horizontal. And that's causing that shape to kind of change as it goes along. So you could go through and have something like kind of twist as it sweeps along using that option if you wanted to. And then the last thing I want to show you as far as a demonstration is just how to go through and make something tangent. So again, I got another example back here that I want to look at. And again, I want to create this surface that you see right here. So again, I want to go through and have it sweep down, and I want it to be tangent to the side surface, and I also want it to be tangent to the solid over here that I've got created. So this is the end result I'm looking for. So I'm going to delete this. How did I get that on there? So to create that again, I'm going to come back here and say, okay, I want to make a sweep. And then again, I am going to make a surface, so I will turn on surface right away. And then for references again, I want to get my trajectories defined. Now for my first trajectory, I'm just going to use this straight line right here. That's going to be my origin. That's what I want to stay normal to as I sweep along. I'm going to move my start point to the other end. And now for trajectory number 2, I'm going to come back over and do control. I'm going to pick the edge of this surface. Now you want to get the edge of the surface. If there was like a curve there, you don't want the curve. You want the edge of the surface. And then once I've got that, I'm going to do control. I'm going to come over and pick the edge here of this as my next trajectory. Now this is where I want to add on to this though. This is kind of a multiple piece edge. So once I've got that one trajectory started, I'm going to do shift and pick these other 2 edges here with that. So I've got my 3 trajectories. And you'll notice here, there's a T column over here now. Do I want to go through and make this tangent or not on here? Now, I'm going to ignore this right now. I'm just going to leave the tangency off. And I'm just going to come over and hit my pencil button. And I'm going to go through and make a sketch. And that's going to turn me into the sketcher. And again, if you look, I've got these X's here, the ends of my trajectories. So I'm going to sketch a spline here for my shape. I just want to go from the end of that to the end of that right there. Spin this around. And then, oops, stop making a spline there. I want to go through and get this to be tangent. So, of course, I'm just going to add a tangent constraint on here. Okay, I want to make this tangent to that right there. I want to make this tangent to this right here. So that will get me tangent at this one point. But if I was to say okay right now and I sweep down, you'll notice it's not tangent over here at this end because I don't have my tangent trajectories turned on. Okay, so that's not going to give me the result that I want on there. Okay, so I could fix this up, but I'm just going to cancel out and start all over again. Let's be just as fast. What I want to do here when I create this sweep is I want to come over here now and get that first trajectory. There's my origin. Move my start point again. Do control. There's my second trajectory over here. We can do control. Here's my third. Add on these other 2 pieces that I need. And I want to make sure I've turned on the T column over here. I want to be tangent to this one surface here that's defined along chain 1. So I just add a check mark to that. Now you'll notice over here for chain number 2, I've got kind of 2 columns here because this edge is defined by 2 surfaces. Do you want to stay normal to the top surface or do you want to stay normal to the side surface? So there's 2 possibilities here. Whereas over here, since this is not a solid, there aren't. Now, it's not obvious here by looking at this which is which. Is it, T number 1 that I want or T number 2 that I want? So you got to kind of guess here. I'm going to come over here and turn on T number 1 here. And now if I come over and say, okay, I want to make my cross section, you'll notice when I go into the sketcher, it gives me these 2 center lines. I actually chose the right one on here. If I made a mistake though, I could just come over here and say, okay, yes, I want to cancel out of this. And what I would need to do is come back over here and turn on the other one. Now, if I was to turn on the other T and then go back into the sketcher, you'll notice how it'll go through and make this other line vertical. So it's really just kind of what face of that solid do you want to maintain tangency to. So you do have to guess sometimes a little bit because there's no easy way to tell. So I'm going to actually go back over here and say, yeah, well, I really want it to be tangent to that, kind of first side of that. And then once I get myself back into the sketcher, again, I'm going to draw the exact same shape, just a spline here with 2 points. And then what I want to do now is when I add my tangent constraint, is I just want to go through and make sure that I use this construction line that the computer gave me. And now what's going to happen is as I sweep along, the computer is going to reevaluate that angle at all points along the sweep. So now when I say okay, you can see here now, if I turn on surface up above, it's going to sweep along, but notice it's tangent everywhere. So at this end here, it's tangent. At this end, it's tangent. Here in the middle, it's tangent. Same thing up above here. I've got a nice tangent connection there as well. So if you're trying to get like a nice smooth connection as you're sweeping along, you've got to go through and use these tangent trajectories to do that. But it's got to be the edge of a solid or it's got to be the edge of a surface for this choice to be available to you. And now when I say done, that would go through and complete that sweep. So you can see sweeps can run the gamut from being really simple to being really complicated, really just depending upon all these different options that you were to come over here and turn on the drop downs down below. But again, very common way to create geometry, gives you a lot of options, a lot of flexibility. So if you haven't been using the sweep command, I definitely recommend that you try that out.